Hello everyone, great to welcome you back to another episode of ideasSpace with the Urban Design Group, Urban Nous and me, Christopher Martin. The series is all about cities and all about cities we live in, exploring the sort of innovative ways and exciting ways we can bring about the change we need to make cities more enjoyable places for people. Today I want to talk about transport, a topic very close to my heart through my work at Urban Movement. And I think basically because transport investment is truly transformative. Very few other forms of investment can target such a broad set of outcomes, from physical health, mental health, community cohesion, urban loneliness, through to combating climate change and delivering more money in shopkeepers' tills. Despite knowing this, we do not innovate with transport investment. We don't think about how we can sweat that investment harder, I don't think. And often investment is funneled into the same old things with potentially rigid methodologies that try to define success based on sometimes flawed models of what we understand to be true. So I'm very happy to be talking to an expert in behavioural science today, because I really think that behavioural science can help maximise transport investment and sweat that investment harder. Pete Dyson is a principal behavioural scientist at the DFT and author of the fascinating book Transport for Humans. I think I just wanted to make clear that Pete's joining us in a personal capacity today as the author of the book. And I'm looking forward to diving into that conversation now. Pete, welcome.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It's really great to have you with us. I think, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the book, some of the work and thinking that went into it?
Yeah, for sure. So some of that needs to come back to some of where I've spent my career. And I've had the good fortune of working with Rory Sutherland, with whom this book is co-authored. And for those that haven't followed Rory's work, he's had some clearly notoriety in advertising and marketing, being the vice chairman of Ogilvy Group, where I worked for about 8 years. He's also outspoken on transport issues. So when the possibility about 4 or 5 years ago came around that we might have a dedicated book specifically on transport, I jumped at the chance to work with him, to research, to write, and now to present the work that we put together. So it's been many years in the making. Over that time, I have changed jobs, and my passion in transport has led me to the Department for Transport, where I currently work in my day job. But I'm keen also to share the work that we've done on this book, which is primarily a really, really broad and creative view and vision for what transport has been, currently is, and could be. And the way in which the book has come about is through research into psychological studies, but also into interesting statistics that show how people really travel. And the method is very much has been immersing, that is Rory and I, ourselves into all kinds of different transport modes. And while it doesn't come out on the page, the book has been written on any number of trains, planes, buses, train stations, cafes overlooking squares, you name it. If it's been moving and it's got a moving table, then we've been on it, which I hope gives the real point of the book is to give a user-centered and people-centered perspective from a psychologist or a behavioural scientist's point of view.
It's a really, really interesting perspective. I think a lot of my thinking around the book wants me to focus a bit on public transport today. In your book, you mention a lot that sort of treating people and passengers like cargo is something that we're really good at in the UK. Huzzah! I wonder if you can expand on this a little bit and tell us how we should be treating people to get more of us using public transport.
Well, treating people as cargo is a term we use throughout the book, and it's an unfortunate but convenient fiction among transport designers to treat people as though they are cargo, or in fact as an entirely different species that we characterize as being called Homo transporticus. So rather than treating us as humans, we're treated as this strange being, and the term extends the character that some listeners might be familiar with, of Homo economicus, which are the economic assumptions that are made to simplify people's decision making. In a transport context, it's a tragic simplification to make when we assume that people know all the routes and they know where they are in space and in time, that they're bestowed with all the knowledge of the fares and tickets, and they know exactly which carriage is the busy carriage, the quiet carriage, how the Wi-Fi works, where the phone signal will or won't be, and so much more besides. Catering, toilets. Imagine all the things that you take for granted on a route that you're familiar with. Unfortunately, many transport models and transport assumptions treat people as though they have all of this knowledge. And that's a problem because our species have some real superpowers, but we also have some super weaknesses. And the way in which we make decisions needs to be accounted for more fully. Otherwise, we end up treating people sometimes with less respect and sometimes with less hope and opportunity than we might like. An example we give, listeners might be familiar when they show up to a train station that the tannoy now doors close 60 seconds before departure. Sometimes it says doors close 2 minutes before departure. Now, that's sort of emblematic as treating the user, the passenger, as something separate from the train which is departing, which, to make the point, if you think about it, once the train doors have closed, you can't get on or off. From the user's point of view, it's effectively departed. The fact that the wheels aren't rolling is incidental. So the departure time should really be when the door's shut and you can't get on or off. And that's a really good example of where we need to treat people and understand people as new customers or as regular customers. And now I've been to many of these stations and many of us are familiar with the 1 minute or 2 minute rule. But imagine that you weren't and this was your first journey. It's rather startling to find that you might well miss the train or bus or whatever that you were hoping to get. It goes on and on like this for longer journeys, and you see something like the Eurostar, for which an enormous amount of effort, billions of pounds, have been spent in speeding it up, which is a good reason, and it needs to be competitive with flying for sure to connect to major capital cities. But the check-in advice still reads that users are advised to arrive 45 to 60 minutes before departure. Now, it turns out if you were to do that, you would find yourself often rather lonely in the waiting area, when in fact you can cut that down to 20 to 30 minutes. So in a hopeful way, and then probably in this case in a sort of human factors perspective, wouldn't it be brilliant that if journey time were important, we would find ways to both speed up the check-in experience of going through security and passport control. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that if we can travel at 200 plus miles an hour, we could speed up that more administrative side of it. And where we can't, that we just provide the assurances that the human brain needs to not be anxious and not be concerned about delays or missing their piece of travel. So a more empathetic approach is why we need to treat people as humans.
It's a great perspective and a really good example. I think that sort of doors closing is here. If the doors are closed, the train's gone. I think it's great. I think, and thinking, speaking more to that sort of experiential design in transport, I think touching on apps and journey planners and tech, which everyone seems to as the kind of the savior of everything, and also sat navs. They've sort of shaped our transport choices over the last few decades, and certainly shaped our behaviours. I think I saw one study saying that there's more vehicles using residential streets now than there were sort of 10, 15 years ago. But also they've sort of potentially skewed what providers think we really want out of transport systems and out of tech. I think just touching on that point, what are some of the flaws that you see with these technologies, and how do we need to sort of get in there and augment them to be smarter?
Yeah. So the book and our perspective, I think, is characteristic of a sort of yes and approach, and it's to say behavioral science and psychology really needs to step up to the plate, and it would be great to be welcome to the sector to provide insights and provide conversation to the debate, which is to say the technology that has developed, it exists now, and it needs to be managed. So it's not a question of yes or no with respect to many innovations, but it's about how do we manage it best. And what a psychologist brings to the table is questioning the extent to which the assumptions that are made in journey planners do actually shape people's preferences, and maybe not in ways that the user wants or society wants. So many times you might be planning a flight, train, or bus journey, and it will need you to specify exactly where and when you're going to travel, when of course the users might have much broader set of needs of saying they might have price as their particular concern, that they're willing to go for anything under so many pounds, or they might have a lot of flexibility of when to go. And they might have particular needs that they want to search for, to say they definitely want a bike space, or that they definitely want changing facilities. So the structures and tariffs that we create end up determining what appear to be revealed preferences of how people travel. Now, the point with journey planners and apps and sat navs is very much that it assumes to optimize for journey time, and in doing so can make some decisions that are maybe ideal for the individual but not ideal for the population overall. And that can mean putting people on the fastest routes with more changes in an underground network, and then making some areas busier than others. And in the case of sat navs, it can end up sending people and distributing traffic into areas that weren't designed for it, that can lead to changes in the community space, which is why you see modal filters and new low traffic neighborhoods. Well, new local, they've existed in many forms in many different ways, but there's a renewed need for them to shape and control traffic in a different way. So we try and look at the ways in which we could humanize some of those preferences. And wouldn't it be great if apps could capture that more messy set of priorities, that someone might say, well, I want a route here that guarantees me phone signal, because if I'm driving or if I'm on a bus or whatever, my priority, the way I'm going to use that journey time is I'm going to speak to somebody. And right now, you would have to go through some very convoluted route of looking at mobile signal maps and tunnels to try and work out how that could possibly be true. But knowing the way the world of work's going, the way the world of connectivity is going, it seems like there's a brighter future in thinking in those terms, rather than there being a future of simply more transport more often and faster.
Yeah, I think I'm always sort of digging down into the journey planning apps, trying to find the one with fewest changes, because what you really want to do is just sit there and have a sort of chunk of valuable time, rather than getting there for 3 minutes earlier when and changing 15 times. So yeah, I can certainly relate to that. I think it's a huge part of that experience. I think sort of turning the screw a little bit on the sort of power of behavioural science, if you will. I think I often speak about this sort of a transport diet in kind of urban design projects, sort of trying to promote sort of us as urban designers looking at transport like we do food health. So we kind of base our mobility systems on what's best for us and best for cities, and then making it easier to more sparingly use what's less good, I suppose. With that in mind, how do you see, or how can we use behavioural science to encourage people to try transport that they don't currently use? Because I think that's the real sort of problem and sticking point, I think, often.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And in the book, we share points about people's travel repertoire and make the metaphor that always choosing the car for every journey, no matter what length, is really the sort of fast food diet of transport. I mean, it works for the individual, but it's a bit of a junk diet to be hopping in the car for all trips. And it's not necessarily in anybody's interest to for that to be encouraged or enabled. The way in which we might get people to choose different routes is definitely definitely a case of behavioural scientists needing to step up to the plate. I'm inspired by a few different methods that sit alongside the engineering that's going to be needed to make routes affordable and broad and easy to use. One of which is a simple study that found that painting the bus route on the side of buses, this was in Bristol, increased the number of car users that switched over to the bus, highlighting the insight that people simply don't necessarily know where those routes go. and with increasing bus priority lanes, seeing that that bus goes here, here, and here along the way can be quite alluring to the car driver otherwise sat in traffic. So again, that's a case of making sure that our public transport doesn't simply assume it's catering to existing demand and existing regular users that depend upon it, and it grows that segment. I think the statistic overall is that something in bus use, 60% of bus users say they would have had no other choice and they would have always needed to use the bus. And that's the slight tragedy here, that it's a sector that hasn't otherwise needed to innovate and cater for increasing customer satisfaction when the broad base of people say they're going to take it no matter what, because they simply need to get from A to B. And hey presto, sometimes you end up with a system that feels quite a lot like that. But with increasing need to attract users back onto the network, with technology that's available to make journeys much, much better and more valuable along the way, and clearly a need to decarbonize, and there's a renewed sort of need for transport to take a more front foot approach. I'm inspired by some other social interventions as well, by the way, like car-free days. I think there's a great possibility that there are changes that people would be reluctant to make if they made it one day, but things that you benefit, the collective benefit from. So a car-free day is a great example whereby someone might be reluctant to change because they say, why would I switch this journey if nobody else is going to? I feel like a bit of a mug here. But if you pick a particular day and you square the particular spaces off, then you can get all those side benefits and show people what a positive experience looks like. So I think behavioral scientists can probably bring a lot to the table with the sort of knowledge of what it is to attract someone to start a habit, and finding those warm and pleasant, potentially leisure journeys that get people into the swing of things, and then try and take it from there.
I think it's a really key point, and I think one that sort of transport authorities should really be listening to hard at the moment in terms of attracting people back onto public transport networks to increase sort of revenues again and get sort of a competitive public transport network. I think we need to be using all these tools in our toolbox. So yeah, I think it's a great time for this book to be surfacing as well.
I'm kind of inspired by another point of the other social world that sort of sits around transport as well. So in order to make environmentally friendly journeys possible, wouldn't it be great if, say, our employers were able to give advice to new employees or prospective applicants about how they would be able to travel to their headquarters? Maybe not every day of the week as it is now, but a lot of jobs still are that way. So that people get smarter commutes. You don't need to join the company, assume that you need a car, only to find that actually it does have bike space. It does have many people traveling from an area near you, and much more. So sort of collecting data is part of I know it doesn't sound so sexy, but collecting information on how people travel is going to be really important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really key point. Really interesting. You highlight in the book that people's perception of roads and urban space kind of affect their use. So if we see streets as only spaces for cars, we get kind of potentially, I would argue, sort of quite cold and unloved streets. How can behavioural science be sort of utilised to give us more convivial streets and neighbourhoods?
Yeah, this is probably where transport specialists are keen to work with urban design, knowing that the street space is only partly used for transport, but it's also used for many other aspects of community in residential areas, but also as a destination in itself, and the recreation, work, and much retail, and so much more. It definitely looks as though the future of transport involves a more fragmented set of modes and set of choices where people are cohabiting, not just in cars and vans and lorries, but also on bikes and e-bikes and e-cargo, potentially with e-scooters, and a lot more. So it's looking a little bit less binary between the pedestrian and the vehicle. An important part is that people's perception of what the road is and is used for is going to shape their use of it. I think a really big move will be a generational sort of stage of learning where people can grow up and gain skills and traveling in different ways that they then use in older life. So longitudinal research, where you track people throughout sometimes months, years, but in this case decades, finds that young people are the most adept at taking up public transport. And if you use public transport when you're younger, you're significantly more likely to when you're older, as controlled for other outside factors. But also points that public transport and being outdoors and traveling has other social benefits. So the study that evaluated the introduction of free bus passes for the elderly found that there were also concurrent increases in well-being, in mental health, in volunteering, and in seeing friends. So enabling people to have greater mobility at different life stages really helps in so many other ways. And that's definitely the forefront to look at these co-benefits of all these schemes.
Yeah, I suppose maybe touching on that a little bit about in sort of in a public transport context as well. I've spoken around sort of train time being useful time. You can sit there and get something done or not if that's what you prefer. I think how can we sort of better sort of plan for the future in terms of sometimes I want a train to be an office, sometimes I want it to be a bar, quite frankly, and sometimes I want it to be a bedroom. It's like how can we allow people to sort of tailor that public transport journey of theirs to what they want out of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I do wonder about this one, and it's that there's a tension between designing for everyone, designing for average, designing for a wide population, and designing for segments or smaller groups of people. We see that come through sometimes in train design, where you have those novel different seating layouts. You might have banks of seating. You clearly have 2x2 seating that faces each other, so sort of as a nod to the group of people speaking to one another. You see generally the removal of those 3 seats, where the middle seat is sort of the least loved seat, possibly used only at the points of greatest necessity in rush hours. I agree with you. I think that you could see that it would be great if there were carriage and vehicle design that accommodated to more types of people. One thing that I'm particularly attentive to is the extent to which some aspects of travel might need to accommodate flexible and remote working, which is to say, can we get to a place where people can have a private phone call, a private meeting while traveling on public transport? And I think we don't currently have that, but did in the past with respect to carriages with separate little cabins. If that time is useful and valuable, especially in a business context, could they be booked, and would that enable people to find the journey time between, say, London and Birmingham particularly valuable?
Yeah, I mean, as you were kind of mentioning that, I was thinking that actually it's all about almost going back in time, isn't it? Because I was also thinking about like why can't we have a decent sort of bar car or restaurant car on trains, really, and I want to be interesting to sort of see at which point that became financially sort of unviable for the train companies to not do. But I always think when I get the Eurostar, I tend to head straight for the standing bar car and just sort of work from there, and it's a bit more convivial, and you get some good conversations there. So I find that a bit more useful time. But
yeah, and I think I would love to hear more from urban designers and architects, and it does also come from the specification that's set by the people procuring the particular rail stock or coaches or what have you, because urban designers are particularly attentive to the need, the fairly deeply human need for some variety and some diversity and some difference in architecture and design. That looking like the same sort of doesn't sit well with people. People clearly want a consistent experience, though. So this is like a really knotty problem. The part that I think behavioral science probably needs to bring to the table is a set of methods, which is to say, social research, qualitative research is really good at asking people, how do you think about this? What are your attitudes towards it? What would you want? But it takes someone on the front foot to say, to suggest different solutions and to do something innovative. Otherwise, we're left with people reporting on other experiences. I think there's loads we could learn internationally as well from the way different operators work. I mean, if you get on a train in Switzerland, it's often a double-decker train, and it's got a children's play area on one of the top decks. And I mean, just imagine a children's play area on a train in the UK. It's it's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like we've got an urban design group challenge. Then everyone can design their own train, and we'll see what people come up with. I think that'd be well worth it. I think just a final question. I think from me is, a lot of the time in the work we do, it's about trying to win back space from cars, and I think at the crux of this, we know people drive, and I can certainly speak to this about certain members of my own family, but they drive for sort of feelings of autonomy and almost certainly feelings of prestige, which are, I'm sure, quite powerful emotional drivers. I think, how can we use behavioural science to make public transport more closely aligned to the sort of these benefits or perceived benefits of car travel, to help people, help the kind of the sort of the die-hard drivers move from vehicles onto public transport?
Yeah, we spend a good chapter early on in the book looking at the extent to which the car has a royal flush of cognitive and psychological biases in its favour. One of those is prestige of ownership, or the costly signalling, the fact that you can demonstrate that you have the freedom and money to own a vehicle, and that's entrenched in some decades, a century, the previous millennia, if you like. It also comes, though, with the car of a set of advantages of simplicity, but of what psychologists would call an availability bias, that it's often right outside your door. The keys are right to hand in your house. It takes no planning to engage. It waits for you, whereas you wait for public transport. It often will have a journey time advantage, even if sometimes you can get stuck in traffic and there's a bit of what you call variance, so it's unreliable. But when the clock's ticking, ultimately the car becomes the more likely choice if you leave too late. So there's some other things to attract public transport use that probably sit in the wider social world, about helping people leave a little bit earlier, whatever that might mean, making the timetables more salient to people, making them so frequent that you don't need to follow a timetable. They sort of show up and go. But also, if punctuality or reliability is a concern to drivers, then softening the arrival times and appointment times that people might have as well. So we see in the UK the drive towards arriving of office work starting at 9, and then the embedded sort of performative nature of work and the presenteeism of there being a difference between being there at 8:55 and 9:05 is something that's not helping the general transport system very much at all, because it leads to everybody going down the same route at the same time. So there's a few things to do to look at car travel. Now, one of the premises of the question was about autonomy and prestige, but I think there's quite a lot that could be done to research present attitudes and beliefs among young people in the UK, for which there's been a steady decline in people taking up driving licenses. When people do pass their test, vehicle ownership has been reducing among those, I think, roughly under the age of 25. So these are generational things that probably shift a little bit. Hopefully you could have some public dialogue whereby people of each generation learn from each other, and hopefully people get to sort of be the change they want to see in the world, and it's for designers to sort of enable and encourage that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice message to finish on, I think, there. I think we will have to draw it to a close. I just want to thank you. It's been a really sort of illuminating conversation. Thanks for taking the time to share your insights, and I would certainly invite everyone involved in the urban design and transport professions to sort of get a copy of your book and read it cover to cover. I think we're definitely going to put a link on the webpage of this episode. So again, thanks to everyone who's listening. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of ideasSpace with the Urban Design Group, Urban Nous, and me, Christopher Martin. More episodes coming your way, so please do get in touch if you have any questions, and sign up to the Urban Design Group Urban Update to catch every conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.